On the day that my retirement was announced at Macquarie University, I was walking across the campus and I came across a well-known professor of chemistry. And she looked agitated. She came running up to me and she said, "Oh my goodness, I've just heard the news. You're retiring. I can't believe it." And I tried to reassure her. I said, "Well, you know, the council of the university has appointed a selection committee and they're going to search far and wide all around the world. And I am sure that they will find a worthy person to be the next vice chancellor." And she smiled at me and said, "Oh, sure, that's what they said last time." But I assure you, I wasn't hurt. I have spent most of my life at universities, and I understand that bluntness is a much cherished aspect of academic life. But being an academic also has its compensations, and one of those is that I get to come to evenings such as this and speak to crowds such as this. So let's get started. Archbishop Julian, Dr. David Daintree, friends, supporters of the Dawson Center, fellow Australians. It's an honor to be here tonight and to be associated, even distantly, with Christopher Dawson. In fact, this speech tonight, in answer to David's earlier question, was inspired by Christopher Dawson when he wrote, "A society which has lost its faith becomes, sooner or later, a society that loses its culture." Now, it's a century or so since he wrote that, and as everybody here knows, our culture is being assailed from many different directions. But what I'd like to do in the time I have available tonight is to try to convince you not to give up hope. It is not yet time to administer the last rites to our culture. My working title for tonight's speech is Faith in Australia. Now, I know that that is an ambiguous title, but bear with me and I will try to resolve the ambiguity before I reach the end of this speech. Now, I'd like to start my remarks by paying my respects to the convicts, soldiers, publicans, whalers, farmers, Indigenous Australians, and everyone else who clubbed together to build this thriving city of Hobart in this beautiful state of Tasmania. These pioneers and their counterparts across the country have made it possible for generations of Australians to live in freedom. Freedom to speak, freedom to worship, freedom to be oneself without fear. This wonderful country that they created has attracted millions of people from elsewhere. And they include my wife, Claire, who was born and raised in Scotland, and me. I came to Australia 45 years ago from Texas. Now, yes. Good on. You too? Oh, okay. So, Texas has always been an interesting state, as you can hear. It's known for cowboys and oil wells and also unusual politicians. And the one I want to tell you about is not George Bush. The one I want to tell you about is a governor whose name was Miriam Ferguson, but Miriam was known affectionately to everyone in Texas as Ma Ferguson. Now, at the time that Ma Ferguson was governor, the Texas state legislature was debating the thorny issue of how to educate the children of Mexican migrants. Should they be taught in their native language of Spanish, or should they be taught in English, or should they be taught in some combination of the two? Now, this is one of these perennial questions that nobody knows the answer to. For all I know, the legislature is still debating it. But at the time, Ma Ferguson was certain she knew the right answer. She said, "Mr. Speaker, it's obvious to me that these children of Mexican migrants should be taught in English." And then to underline her point, she picked up the Holy Bible, which sits in front of every member of the Texas State Legislature, and she pointed to it. And she said, if English is good enough for Jesus Christ, then English should be good enough for him. Now, clearly, Ma Ferguson was not aware of the full range of linguistic diversity. Everybody she knew spoke either English or Spanish, and she was pretty sure Jesus didn't speak Spanish. So it's impossible to live that kind of a blinkered life here in Australia. A symphony of languages fills our city streets, and a medley of tastes and traditions enrich our cities. A remarkable number, 30% of everyone in Australia was born somewhere else. Right? That's double the percentage of Britons or Americans who were born abroad. Now, Dorothea McKellar poetically immortalized Australia as a sunburnt country, and it's the perfect image. Australia's warm sun has attracted migrants from 190 different countries. So they represent a kaleidoscope of ethnicities, religions, and cultures, all associated with one thing, seeking to have a better life. And the optimism of these migrant families is evident in the fact that they're still having children, while the general population is getting mired in a kind of stagnation. Australia has a lot to be proud of. And yet, there's a kind of discordant note that's been somehow infiltrating into our national conversation. According to some politicians and some intellectuals and some ABC personalities, Australia is xenophobic, sexist, and racist. It's a conundrum. On the one hand, we have people from all over the world getting in a queue to try to come here, while here at home we vilify our past and we denigrate any form of patriotism. Australia Day, which was once a day of pride, is now seen to be a kind of center of controversy. We are told that the convicts who landed on our shores in 1788, bound in chains, remember, people who would have rather have been anywhere else in the world, somehow or other constituted an invasion force. And Australia Day is a day of shame. Citizenship ceremonies are cancelled by local councils, sporting commentators refuse to mention the day, and one supermarket chain refused to even sell little paper Australian flags. Patriotism, the love of one's country, has somehow become something shameful. We're being really encouraged to hate ourselves instead. Now, of course, Australia, like any country in the world, faces its challenges. And sometimes we falter. Acknowledging our past, studying our past, both the good and the bad, is essential if we're going to learn from any of our mistakes. And it will also inspire us to reach higher levels of fairness and higher levels of freedom. Self-hate, self-loathing only leads to despair and nihilism. Now, to understand how we reach this point, we have to have a look at our educational institutions. And I particularly want to look at our universities. Now, the first university, the University of Sydney, was launched by William Charles Wentworth in 1850. And at the time, this is what he claimed for his new university. It will enlighten the mind, refine the understanding, and elevate the soul. 2 years later, in 1852, John Henry Newman published The Idea of a University, in which he made very similar arguments for establishing the first Catholic university in Dublin. Now, both of these people, both Wentworth and Newman, viewed education in moral terms. Right? So following Plato, they believed that education makes people good, and good people act nobly. Unfortunately, educational institutions have not always lived up to these noble aims, to these lofty aims. In his Confession, St. Augustine, he describes what it was like to arrive at the ancient equivalent of a university. He writes, "To Carthage then I came, where a cauldron of unholy love sang around my ears." A cauldron of unholy loves. What would he say if he went to an Australian university today? You can study anything in an Australian university. You can learn to keep accounts. You can learn to calculate planetary movements. You can learn to speak Japanese. At Swinburne University, students learn to do handstands as part of the circus arts degree. I didn't make that up. That's real. But elevating the soul is no longer on the curriculum. Consider, and neither, by the way, is our Western heritage. Think about Shakespeare for a moment. In 2024, you're more likely to encounter Shakespeare if you're a Chinese student studying in the University of Peking than you are studying in an Australian university. Academics in Australia have now dismissed the Bard of Avon as a white male relic of a patriarchal era. And you know who they've replaced him with? Taylor Swift. I'm not making this up either. According to Australian academics pursuing Swiftian studies, Miss Swift's work is, I have to quote here, impacted our contemporary life across the intersection of music, economics, business, media studies, and health. One scholar claimed that Miss Swift's lyrics contain fascinating arrays of modern sonnet sequences. So who needs Shakespeare's sonnets when you can have Taylor Swift's? Universities that owe their very existence to the values that define Western civilization no longer believe in those values, the values that led to their own creation. A few years ago, in response to a very generous philanthropic offer to support the teaching of Western civilization, 100 academics from the University of Sydney signed an open letter opposing the teaching of any aspect of Western civilization. Instead of preserving the culture, the university said that its new mission will be to help students, quote, unlearn truth. The way the world works has changed, they said. Things you thought you knew are no longer true. You must unlearn old wisdoms and discover new ones. Wisdoms indeed. Sounds like even grammar has to be unlearned. Now, of course, facing new knowledge, learning about new things and perspectives is crucial. But how do you progress as a society if you reject the very concept of truth? In his book, The Undoing of Thought, the French philosopher Alain Finkielkraut writes, when hatred of the culture becomes part of the culture, then the life of the mind loses all meaning. Well, I'm sad to say that higher education provides many examples of them. Visit any university in Australia and you will find an infinitude of sexual genders, right? Of many numbers of them, and linguistic absurdities such as replacing breastfeeding with chest feeding, or substituting birthing person for what we quaintly call mother. Now, I think it would be impossible to write a satirical novel about the modern university because any invented exaggeration couldn't possibly cover the reality. Let me tell you about a female student who applied to a prestigious women's college and was admitted. When she arrived at the college, she announced that she no longer identified as a female. She now identifies as a masculine of center genderqueer. Yeah, I can see what you're thinking. I don't know either. Google it. She named herself Timothy and asked to be referred to by masculine pronouns. Timothy then decided to run for the post of diversity officer. And to Timothy's chagrin, Timothy's fellow students would not vote for him because Timothy was now a white male and therefore insufficiently diverse for the role of diversity officer. Now, some of it is sadder as well. I grew up in the USA, a time when segregation was still the law in some parts of the country. So I'm particularly appalled by Australian universities that set aside separate social spaces based on race. Somewhere up in heaven, Nelson Mandela and Martin Luther King are probably weeping. Now, as you can probably guess, these campus absurdities, orthodoxies, weird ideas, they arise and they spread without any belief in God. But they do believe in the devil. The devil is anyone who objects. Academics are thrown off the campus, vilified, shunned, banished. Professors have been fired for saying that there are only two biological sexes. Some of those professors were medical professors. Cowardice and fear keep academics and vice-chancellors parroting woke nonsense they don't really believe. Now, I guess all of this upheaval would be worthwhile if it somehow good came out of it, if some big change for the better, if it helped students lead more meaningful lives, perhaps. But it doesn't. Unfortunately, it's having exactly the opposite effect. Young people are miserable. According to a Menzies Centre report, 39% of young Australians had some sort of mental disorder last year. And it's even worse if you focus on females, where the figure from the Australian Bureau of Statistics is 46%. Almost half of women aged 16 to 24 had some kind of mental disorder in the last 12 months. Now, some observers have tried to put a positive spin on this. They've said, well, the increase in mental disorders really represents a more willingness to talk about things that you wouldn't talk about in the past. But unfortunately, this explosion in mental disorders is not just talk. Right? Do you know what the leading cause of death is in young people between the ages of 15 and 24? It's suicide. That's what it is. These are our children. These are our grandchildren. What do we do when they do not feel that life is worth living? So we do in Australia what we always do. We turn to the government and say, can you solve this? And the government has declared zero tolerance for suicide. Well, and domestic violence, and many other things indeed. That's terrible, Mike. And many other things indeed, and it has promised to spend gajillion dollars to cure it. And I'm making fun of it, but I think they're well-meaning. And I think that the people who are trying to do something are admirable. But I can't help thinking about Oliver Goldsmith's famous line, how small of all things that human hearts endure, that part which laws or kings can cause or cure. Suicide occurs when life is so meaningless that it is too painful to live. And such a deep-seated anguish is a malaise of the soul. It's a despair that no government advertising campaign can ever hope to heal. Now, as you know, better than most, there was a time when religion and communal traditions offered solace and answers to life's eternal questions. Unfortunately, the melancholy, long withdrawing roar of the sea of faith has left many of our young people stranded in a desert of uncertainty. Our youth are no longer at ease in the old dispensation, and yet they continue to wrestle with the same old questions. How do I live? Why am I here? What is good? Our government and educational institutions are either unwilling or unable to offer any guidance. And when you live in a culture that's marred by cynicism and self-loathing, it's all too easy for young people to fall into that pit of nihilism, seeing life as a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury and signifying nothing. Yes, as the title of this colloquium today shows, we live in a time of cultural crisis. Yet, despite these well-known challenges, I have faith in Australia. First of all, the country has come through far worse than this. Every decade of Australia's history has put forward its own challenges. During the Great Depression of the 1930s, 32% of Australians were unemployed. The figure today is 3.2%, and we are one of the richest countries in the world. The Japanese bombing raids that killed hundreds of people in the 1940s in Broome, in Townsville, in Darwin, have gone. Japan is now our closest, or one of our closest allies. The Vietnam War of the 1960s and 70s scarred and divided the nation and ruined many lives. Today, Vietnamese people are thriving in Australia, and their country is one of the major tourist destinations for Australians traveling abroad. Cyclone Tracy, the Black Saturday bushfires, the Great Brisbane fires, all of these were deadly, all of these were costly, and all of these were met with compassion, mutual aid, and all those communities have been rebuilt by Australians helping one another. Our life is a precious gift. It's there to be cherished. And I believe that we can overcome this spiritual malaise. But it won't be easy. It will take work, hard work. Now, you've heard this quote already today, but I'm going to repeat it. Do not be conformed. Do not be conformed to this world, said St. Paul, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, so that you may discern what is good and what is the will of God and what is acceptable, good, and perfect. And once you do discern what is good, you have got to push as hard as the age that pushes against you. And I'm delighted to tell you tonight, the pushing has started. A $450 million campaign to divide Australia on racial grounds, right, was roundly defeated, overwhelmingly defeated. It seems that Australians prefer common sense to emotional blackmail. They prefer cohesion to division, and a fair go to favoritism. And despite a tiny minority, which I've talked about, patriotism, the faith in our future, is still alive, and I think it's growing stronger. This year was the we witnessed the largest outcome for Anzac Day in history. And millions joined in Australia Day celebrations, whether people liked it or not. The recent resurgence of classical education, which you all know about, suggests that parents and students, shocked by what they see in schools and in campus, are also pushing back and returning to fundamental educational values. Now, I'm not only optimistic about patriotism, but I'm also optimistic about religious faith. Now, it is true that if you look at the census, the number of people who say they're Anglican or Catholic has decreased. But the number who say they're Christian has gone up. And so has the number of people following other religions. And you can see it every day. We unite to support one another during natural disorders, but our faith is best demonstrated in everyday things. Those Wordsworth's little nameless, unremembered acts of kindness and love. I had a terrible bike accident. It was really a surprise to me when it happened. An army of strangers, young and old, people from various walks of life, immediately rushed to my aid. It's a testament to the strong communal bonds that exist in this country. And you can see it every day. Nurses, doctors, teachers, police, they demonstrate and display the very essence of grace, every day of the week. Now, I started this speech by saying that the title, Faith in Australia, has two meanings. Now, I'd like to try to resolve that ambiguity. Patriotism means more than just cheering for our national sporting teams. And faith means more than just participating in church rituals and singing hymns. Faith is not a lifestyle choice. It is a call to action. It's a call to push back, to mend what pernicious ideas about race and gender and patriotism have torn apart. Faith isn't easy, it's hard. It requires courage and persistence and everyday practice. And so does patriotism. So maybe the title of this talk is not so ambiguous after all. Patriots and the religious faithful face very similar challenges to defend what is good, what is right, and what is perfect. So if I may paraphrase the Dawson quote that inspired this talk in the first place, a society that preserves its culture will also preserve its religious faith. And that's the reason I am optimistic. I know that we can preserve our culture and that we will ensure a bright tomorrow for everyone who calls this country home. One last thing. When I was Vice Chancellor, I like to end graduation ceremonies with an Irish blessing. And this caused considerable consternation among my colleagues. In fact, an emergency faculty meeting had to be called to discuss my aberrant behavior. My colleagues informed me that atheists and people who were not Christian would be distressed by my blessing. You must understand, Vice Chancellor, they said, this ain't America. Well, I persisted, and I never had a single complaint. So I hope that you won't mind if I finish my talk by saying, may the road rise to meet you, may the wind be always at your back, may the sun shine gently on your face, and the rains fall soft on your fields, and until we meet again, may God hold you in the palm of his hands. Thank you.